Welcome to Survival Horror Ambience, where the darkness has a story to tell. Tonight, we're gathered around the fire in the woods. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. So, grab your flashlight, keep your eyes on the tree line. And if you love horror, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a night like this. Now, let's begin. I used to work as a summer counselor at a small campground in northern Nevada, not too far from Lake Mead. During the day, it was the perfect picture of nature, tall pines, sparkling water, and crisp mountain air. But at night, the woods felt different, like they held secrets just beyond the glow of our campfires. That summer, I was in charge of the youngest campers, the 6- and 7-year-olds. Most of them were energetic but well-behaved, except for one. Ryan had a knack for mischief. He loved sneaking out of his cabin, playing tricks, and giving the other kids a fright. Most of the time, I could keep up with him, but one night, he vanished. It was around 10 p.m. when I noticed his sleeping bag was empty. Concerned, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, careful not to wake the others. I assumed he had gone to the outhouse. Now, these weren't modern restrooms, just small wooden stalls with a hole in the ground. No plumbing, no lights, and not exactly the most inviting place after dark. The kids usually avoided them at night. So when I saw Ryan's flashlight flickering near the outhouse, I was surprised. I was about to call out to him when I heard something unusual. A soft scraping sound. I paused, my grip tightening on the flashlight. Ryan stood just outside the outhouse, staring at the door, which was slightly ajar. A faint, wheezing breath came from inside. The door creaked open just a little more. Ryan took a step back. "Hello," he called hesitantly. I was just about to rush over when I saw a hand, pale and thin, slowly curled around the doorframe. Ryan stood frozen in place. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him to come back, but my voice wouldn't come. Then, it moved. A figure emerged from the shadows, not walking but slowly crawling forward. Its limbs seemed too long, its movements unnatural, as if it didn't quite belong. Its face. It had no eyes, just deep, empty sockets. Ryan dropped his flashlight. The thing snapped its head toward him. Then it lunged. Ryan screamed, and suddenly, I could move again. I bolted toward him, grabbed him by the back of his shirt, and yanked him backward. We tumbled to the ground, just as the thing let out a horrible gurgling sound. I didn't look back. I just ran. Ryan was sobbing as I dragged him back to camp. I didn't stop until we were inside a cabin, door locked, lights on. Neither of us slept that night. And the next morning when I went back to the outhouse, the door was wide open. But inside, nothing. Just a deep black pit. I didn't say anything to the other counselors. What the hell was I supposed to say? Hey, there's some kind of eyeless creature living in the outhouse, and it tried to eat Ryan last night. They'd think I was either crazy or playing along with Ryan's pranks. So I kept my mouth shut. Ryan, though, he wouldn't stop talking about it. At breakfast, he whispered to the other kids, his voice shaking. There was something in there. It came out. It chased me. The older kids laughed. One of the other counselors, Mark, gave me a look like handle your camper. I pulled Ryan aside after breakfast. Listen, I said. No more talking about last night. We're not scaring the other kids. He looked up at me, his face still pale. But it was real. I didn't know what to say to that. By the afternoon, things started to feel normal again. The sun was out. Kids were playing, and I almost convinced myself that maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a shadow, an animal, something that my brain had twisted into a nightmare. Then, later that evening, something happened that killed that idea real fast. It was just before lights out. The campers were settling in, and I was making one last round before heading to bed. That's when I heard it. A soft thud. It came from behind the mess hall, near the outhouse. I hesitated. It was probably just the wind or an animal, but I decided to check, just to be sure. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside. The night was unusually quiet. No wind, no crickets, just stillness. Then, another thud. It came from inside the outhouse. I stopped, my flashlight hovering over the closed door. A faint rustling sound followed, like something shifting inside. I considered heading back, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I reached for the door and eased it open. At first, I saw nothing, just the small, dim interior. Then, a quiet sound, a slow, steady movement. I aimed my flashlight downward. Something shifted, just beyond the beam of light. Not an animal, not a person, just a shadow pressed against the ground, barely visible. For a moment, everything was still. Then, it moved slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something pale before stepping back. That was all I needed to see. I quietly closed the door and walked back to my cabin, my pulse quickening. Ryan, one of the campers, was still awake. He looked at me from his bunk. "You saw something, didn't you?" he asked softly. I didn't answer. I just nodded. That was my last summer at camp. I never mentioned that night again. And the strangest part? That campground is still open. It was our last night at Blackwood Camp, and the air was filled with the scent of campfire smoke and toasted marshmallows. The 6 of us, me, Jake, Sam, Lauren, Mike, and our counselor, Dave, sat around the fading glow of the fire, enjoying the warmth against the cool night air. "All right," Dave said, stretching his legs. "Who's got one last spooky story before we call it a night?" "I've got one," Jake said with a grin. "You guys ever hear about the Faceless Man?" Lauren sighed. "That old campfire tale. Come on." But Dave leaned forward, intrigued. "Wait, I think I've heard of that. Isn't he the one who appears when you say his name 3 times? Jake's grin widened. "Exactly. The story goes that, years ago, a camper went missing in these woods. They searched everywhere but never found him. Then, one night, another camper woke up and saw someone standing near their tent, a tall figure with no face." Sam shivered. "I don't like this," Jake continued, unfazed. "The kid panicked, but by the time the counselors checked, there was no one there. After that, people kept seeing him, always just beyond the firelight, watching." I shifted, glancing at the shadows beyond our own fire. "They say if you say his name 3 times near a campfire, he appears," Jake said, lowering his voice. "Just standing there. And if you look away, even for a second, he gets closer." The fire crackled, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Mike smirked. "So let's try it." Sam shook her head. "No way. Come on, it's just a story," Mike said, rolling his eyes. He turned to me. "What do you think?" I hesitated, glancing again at the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "I mean, it's probably just a legend." Dave sighed. "Look, I don't usually believe in this kind of stuff, but there's a reason legends stick around. Maybe let's not mess with it." But Mike was already grinning. "Faceless man, faceless man, faceless man." Then, somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped. We all froze. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Another snap. Closer this time. The fire suddenly dimmed, like the night was swallowing it. The shadows around us stretched, twisting unnaturally. Then Lauren whispered, Is someone standing over there?" I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. Just beyond the firelight, half hidden in the trees, was a tall, motionless figure. And it had no face. No one moved. No one spoke. The figure stood just beyond the firelight, tall, completely still. Its face, or the absence of one, was smooth and featureless, like a mannequin left out in the woods. Lauren let out a shaky breath. That's a joke, right? Someone's messing with us." Jake swallowed hard. I don't think so." A twig snapped as the figure took a step forward. I instinctively pulled back, my pulse racing. The fire flickered, the glow seeming to shrink, as if the night itself was creeping in. Sam gripped my arm. "If we don't look away, he can't get closer, right?" But that wasn't how the story went. It only moved when we weren't looking. Which meant we must have looked away. Mike's voice wavered. "What do we do, Dave?" Our counselor, the one who was supposed to have all the answers, just stood there, frozen. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "It's just a story." But it didn't feel like just a story. The figure took another step forward. It was closer now, just at the edge of the fire's glow. Then it tilted its head, as if watching us. And that's when Lauren screamed. The fire guttered out completely. Panic. Darkness. Someone grabbed my arm. I heard scrambling, the sounds of people running. Someone crying, maybe Sam. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. I clicked it on, and the beam flickered before dying completely. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Right. Behind. Me. I spun around, swinging my arms wildly, but there was nothing. Just endless, suffocating blackness. Then, the fire roared back to life. We were alone. The faceless man was gone. We stood there, shaking, our breath visible in the cold air. Dave finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Camp's over. We're packing up. Now." Nobody argued. We left that night, stuffing our things into our bags, cramming into the van. No one spoke the entire ride back. I don't know what we saw that night. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was a trick of the dark. Or maybe he's still out there, waiting for someone else to say his name. I was 12 the summer my parents sent me to a week-long sleepaway camp deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania. It was my first time away from home for more than a night, and I was equal parts nervous and excited. The camp itself was pretty basic. Cabins, a mess hall, a lake for swimming, but for some reason, Our group was assigned lean-tos instead of actual cabins. If you've never seen one, a lean-to is basically a three-sided wooden shelter with an open front. They weren't much protection from the elements, and, as I quickly realized, they didn't offer much protection from anything else either. The first few days were fun. We hiked, swam, and sat around the campfire listening to ghost stories that the counselors swore were true. I didn't believe them. I wish I could say the same about what happened next. It was our fourth night there. I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal. There were plenty of deer and we'd even seen a black bear rummaging through the trash bins behind the mess hall earlier that day. But this was different. The footsteps were too steady, too deliberate. I turned over in my sleeping bag and squinted into the dark. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough of a glow to see the trees lining the clearing. That's when I saw him. A man, standing just beyond the firelight. He wasn't moving, just standing there between the trees, watching. His clothes looked dark and ragged, and even from a distance, I could tell something was off. I froze. My brain struggled to make sense of it. Was it a counselor? A late arrival? Someone playing a prank? Then he took a step closer. I jolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hey," I whispered harshly, shaking my friend Matt beside me. He groaned, but didn't wake up. I looked back. The man was still there, still watching. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Click. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the spot where he had been. But he was gone. I stared for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I had. Maybe my brain was still wired from the ghost stories earlier. I eventually lay back down, but sleep never came. Every rustling leaf, every distant crack of a branch had me wide-eyed and gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light. A shadow. Nothing. I wish that were true. Because by the next night, we'd find out I wasn't imagining things. The next morning, I told the counselors what I saw. I expected them to take it seriously. After all, we were kids sleeping in open shelters in the middle of the woods. But instead, they laughed it off. It was probably a deer, one of them said. Or maybe Bigfoot, another joked, nudging my shoulder. Even my friends didn't believe me. Matt said I must have been dreaming. The other guys started making up stories about the ghost of Camp Wrenwood, turning it into a joke before breakfast was even over. I wanted to let it go. I really did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something real, something dangerous. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening. The fire crackled, the wind moved through the trees, and eventually, the sound of my bunkmates' breathing settled into a slow rhythm as they drifted off to sleep. And then, a branch snapped. I felt my stomach drop. Turned toward the tree line, barely breathing. My flashlight was in my hand, but I hesitated to turn it on. What if I saw him again? Seconds passed. Then a minute. Nothing. I started to think maybe it had just been my imagination. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closer. My fingers fumbled over the switch of my flashlight. I braced myself, clicked it on, and a scream. Not mine, one of the girls from the other lean-to. A counselor's voice shouted in the distance, and suddenly, the whole camp was awake. I shot up as Matt and the others stirred beside me. We grabbed our flashlights and ran toward the noise, beams of light cutting through the darkness. The girls' lean-to was about 30 yards away, and by the time we got there, they were huddled together, eyes wide with fear. He was here, one of them cried. Right outside. A counselor knelt beside them, trying to soothe them, while another swept the woods with a flashlight. "Who?" they asked gently. "The man." My stomach dropped. More counselors arrived, murmuring to each other. One of them clutched a walkie-talkie, speaking in hushed tones. Then, in the distance, sirens. They gathered us all in the mess hall while the adults sorted things out. Everyone was talking at once, trying to make sense of what had happened. The girls insisted they had seen someone moving between the trees, closer than before. One of them had even woken up to find him just a few feet away. The air felt heavy, charged with nervous energy. Whatever had happened, it wasn't just a campfire story anymore. That was when she screamed. An hour later, the head counselor made an announcement. "There's nothing to worry about," she said. "The police are checking the area, but you're all safe. It was probably just a drifter passing through." But she looked nervous. The next morning, they ended camp early. Parents were called. Bags were packed. No real explanation was given, just that they thought it was best to cut the trip short. I didn't find out the truth until weeks later. My mom was watching the news when I walked into the room. I wasn't paying attention until I caught a glimpse of a photo on the screen. A man's face. his mugshot. Escaped from a minimum security prison late last week, the anchor reported. Authorities say he had been on the run for several days before finally being spotted near a campground in northern Pennsylvania. My stomach tightened. They caught him, miles away from where we had been. But for at least one night he had been there, in the woods, watching. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know what would have happened if the girls hadn't woken up. But I do know one thing. That first night, when I saw him, he saw me too. There's an old camp hidden deep in the woods of New York. It's been abandoned for years, but if you ask the locals, they'll share eerie stories. Tales of strange lights in the trees, voices drifting through the night air, and campers who swore they saw something watching them. We were just a group of friends looking for a little adventure. It was me, my best friend Kyle, and our buddy Marcus. We had just graduated high school, and before heading off to college, we wanted one last trip together. Marcus had heard about the camp from his older brother, some place that had shut down in the 80s after what people only referred to as an accident. No, one really knew the details, just rumors about a counselor who vanished and unusual sightings ever since. So, naturally, we thought it'd be a great spot to spend the night. Finding the place wasn't easy. We drove for hours down winding dirt roads, barely more than overgrown trails. When we finally arrived, it looked exactly how you'd imagine. Weathered cabins, a rusted-out sign that once read Camp Echo Pines, and a fire pit that, strangely, seemed like it had been used recently. That probably should have been our first sign to turn back. We set up our tents near the old lodge, a 2-story building that had seen better days. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the empty camp. The air felt off, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Kyle was the first to break the silence with a laugh. "This place is straight out of a horror movie." Marcus smirked, tossing another log onto the fire. Then I called Final Guy. "You two can go first." We sat around, telling stories and joking like we always did, but something about the place gnawed at me. It felt like we weren't alone. Then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, rustling in the trees, the kind of sound you'd expect from small animals moving through the underbrush. We ignored it. But then came the snapping twigs, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, not just one pair, multiple. Kyle grabbed his flashlight, sweeping the beam toward the woods. "Probably just deer," he muttered, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Marcus, always the loudest in the group, stood up and crossed his arms. "If someone's out there, you better say something, 'cause I'm not playing games." Silence. Then, a whisper, soft, breathless, coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. A single word. "Stay." My stomach dropped. I could tell from the way Kyle's grip tightened on the flashlight that he heard it too. Marcus scoffed, shaking his head. "You guys are messing with me." We weren't. And we should have left right then and there. But we didn't. And that was our mistake. Then, a soft shuffle in the leaves. Kyle swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only caught glimpses of thick trees and empty space. "Screw this, man," he muttered. "We should go." Marcus groaned. "Dude, it's just the woods. Animals move around at night. That's what they do." But I wasn't buying it. I grew up camping. Raccoons, deer, even coyotes weren't new to me. But this felt different. It felt wrong. Then we heard it. A laugh. Low, raspy, and way too close. Kyle dropped his flashlight. Nope. "We're leaving." Marcus finally looked shaken. That wasn't you guys?" I didn't even bother answering. I was already shoving my stuff into my backpack, my hands shaking. The fire flickered as the wind picked up, and suddenly, something moved at the edge of the trees. I only saw it for a second. A figure, just beyond the tree line. Its shape was human, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs just slightly off, like a puppet with its strings tangled. And though I couldn't see its face, I felt it watching. Kyle cursed under his breath, scrambling for his dropped flashlight. Marcus, for once in his life, was dead silent. The fire sputtered, casting flickering shadows across the empty cabins. The wind whispered through the trees, but beneath it, just barely, I heard it again. The laugh. Closer this time. "We need to go," I hissed. "Now." Kyle didn't argue. He grabbed his flashlight with shaking hands, but when he lifted it, the beam flickered, like something was draining the power. Marcus finally broke out of his trance. Yeah. He snatched his backpack, but before he could sling it over his shoulder, a branch snapped behind us. We spun toward the sound. Nothing. Then, a whisper right behind me. "Stay." I didn't think. I didn't turn around. I just ran. Not an animal. Not a person. Just a shadow standing too still to be anything normal. Kyle must have seen it too, because he let out a strangled sound and bolted for the car. Marcus hesitated, staring into the trees like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't real. Then we heard it again. That same whisper. Stay. That was enough for Marcus. He took off running, and I was right behind him. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut. Kyle fumbled with the keys, cursing under his breath as he struggled to start the engine. When it finally roared to life, we didn't waste a second. We peeled out of there, the abandoned camp disappearing in the rearview mirror. We didn't stop driving until we were back on the main road, civilization finally in sight. Only then did Kyle pull over, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. Marcus let out a nervous laugh. Okay, that was weird, but probably just some other kids messing with us, right? Kyle didn't answer. I just stared out the window, back toward the dark woods, because there was one thing I didn't tell them. When I saw that shadow in the trees, it wasn't alone. The fire is fading, but these stories, they'll follow you home. If you've ever heard something strange in the woods, drop a comment below. We want to hear your tales. And if you made it through the night, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow horror fans. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and whatever you do, don't ignore the whispers in the dark.